The scissors gleamed in the lamplight like an executioner's blade, poised above Clara Bennett's chestnut hair, the last beautiful thing she owned in this god-forsaken world. Outside, a Colorado blizzard screamed its fury, while inside her daughter's fevered whimpers grew weaker by the hour. This was it, the final trade, her beauty for her child's life. But what Clara didn't know was that 7 miles away, a cowboy named Elias Ward was saddling his horse, about to change both their destinies forever. This is their story, a tale of desperation, dignity, and a love forged in the coldest winter Colorado ever knew. Stay with me until the end and comment below what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The wind had teeth that winter. Clara Bennett had learned this truth the hard way through 6 months of widowhood that had stripped her down to nothing but bone determination and a love for her daughter that burned hotter than any fire she could no longer afford to keep lit. She stood now in the dark corner of her cabin. Calling it a cabin was generous. It was barely more than a shack with delusions of grandeur, holding a pair of sewing scissors that caught the weak light of her last candle. Her hands shook. Not from the cold, though God knew it was cold enough to freeze the tears on a woman's face before they could fall. No, her hand shook because of what she was about to do. "Mama!" The small voice came from the pile of blankets in the corner where 5-year-old Lucy lay wrapped in every piece of fabric Clara owned. "Mama, I'm cold." "I know, sweet pea, I know." Clara's voice cracked like ice on a frozen pond. She blinked hard, forcing back the tears that threatened to fall. Tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. Water was for drinking, not wasting. "Mama's going to fix that. I promise, promises." She'd made so many of them lately, and she was terrified she wouldn't be able to keep any of them. 6 months ago, Thomas Bennett had been alive. 6 months ago, Clara had been a wife, not a widow. 6 months ago, there had been food in the cupboard, wood for the fire, and hope, that rarest of commodities, in her heart. Then the influenza came, sweeping through their small homestead like the angel of death, taking Thomas in less than a week and leaving Clara alone with a child, a failing farm, and debt she had no way to pay. She'd tried everything, sold the livestock, what little they'd had, sold Thomas's tools, his boots, his rifle, sold everything that wasn't nailed down, and then she'd started prying up the nails. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. The land taxes were due. The general store wouldn't extend her credit anymore. And worst of all, Lucy had developed the same fever that had taken Thomas. Clara could see death circling her daughter like a vulture, patient and inevitable, waiting for hunger and cold to finish what the disease had started. So here she stood, scissors in hand, preparing to cut off her hair. It wasn't vanity that made her hesitate. Clara Bennett had long since abandoned vanity, along with everything else that belonged to the woman she'd been before. But her hair, thick chestnut brown, falling past her waist in waves that Thomas had loved to run his fingers through, was the last piece of her old life. The last thing that proved she'd once been more than this desperate creature fighting for survival in the wilderness. And it was valuable. She'd heard the stories. Women in the cities paid good money for hair like hers. Hair for wigs, for decorations, for all the frivolous things that rich women bought, while women like Clara starved. "It's just hair," she whispered to herself. "It grows back." But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. Maybe the hair would grow back, but the woman who'd owned it before, the Clara who'd laughed easily, who'd sung while she worked, who'd believed the world was fundamentally good, that woman was gone forever. This was just one more piece of her to feed to the monster of survival. She gathered her hair in one hand, feeling its weight, its warmth. Then she positioned the scissors. "Mama, what are you doing?" Clara turned to see Lucy had pushed herself up on one elbow, her small face pale as moonlight in the candlelight, her eyes glassy with fever, but still alert enough to see what was happening. "Nothing, darling. Lie back down. You're cutting your hair." It wasn't a question. Lucy might be only 5, but she was sharp as a tack, even fever adult. "Why? How did you explain this to a child? How did you tell your daughter that you were going to trade pieces of yourself for her survival? That you'd give anything, everything, every last shred of dignity you possessed if it meant keeping her alive one more day?" "I'm going to town tomorrow, sweet pea." And this, Clara held up a handful of her hair. This is going to buy us food and medicine for you. Will it buy enough for both of us? Lucy's voice was so small, so fragile, Clara's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. Yes, baby. Enough for both of us. Another lie. Another promise. She wasn't sure she could keep because the truth was she had no idea how much her hair was worth. She had no idea if it would buy enough food to last a week, a day, or even a single meal. All she knew was that it was the only thing she had left to sell. And she was going to sell it. And if it wasn't enough, she'd figure something else out. She always did. She'd been figuring things out for 6 months now, surviving on nothing but stubbornness and the fierce primal love that every mother feels for her child. That love was the only thing that kept her going. The only thing that dragged her out of bed each morning when every bone in her body screamed for rest, for relief, for release from this endless struggle. Go to sleep, Lucy. Save your strength. Will you sing to me? Clara almost laughed. Sing? When was the last time she'd sung? When was the last time she'd felt anything but fear and exhaustion? But she moved to her daughter's side, kneeling on the cold floor, and took Lucy's small, hot hand in hers. And because her daughter asked, because her daughter needed her, she sang, "Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Mama's going to buy you a mockingbird." The old lullaby felt like a cruel joke. She wasn't going to buy Lucy a mockingbird. She was going to buy bread if she was lucky. Maybe some cornmeal, maybe medicine, though that was probably hoping for too much. But she sang anyway, her voice cracking, tears finally spilling down her cheeks in the darkness where Lucy couldn't see them. She sang until Lucy's breathing deepened and the child drifted into fitful sleep. Then she stayed there, kneeling on the cold floor, holding her daughter's hand until the candle burned down to nothing and darkness swallowed the cabin whole. In that darkness, Clara Bennett made her decision. Tomorrow she would walk the 7 mi to town. Tomorrow she would trade her hair for whatever it would bring. And if it wasn't enough, she'd find another way. She'd beg, she'd borrow, she'd steal if she had to, because Lucy was going to survive this winter, even if Clara had to sell every piece of herself to make it happen. She didn't sleep that night. How could she? Instead, she waited for dawn, watching the darkness gradually lighten through the gaps in the cabin walls, listening to Lucy's labored breathing and preparing herself for what was to come. When the first grey light of morning crept across the floor, Clara stood and stretched her stiff, aching body. She'd slept in her clothes, her only clothes really, a worn calico dress that had been patched so many times it was more patches than original fabric. She wrapped herself in the thin shawl that had been her mother's, the only inheritance she'd received, and allowed herself one moment of weakness, pressing the shawl to her face and breathing in the faint scent that still clung to it. Lavender and bread, the smell of love, of safety, of a childhood that seemed impossibly distant now. Then she tucked the shawl around her shoulders and turned to her daughter. Lucy was still sleeping, her breathing slightly easier than it had been the night before. That was something, at least, a small mercy in a season of cruelties. Clara knelt beside her and pressed a kiss to her forehead, feeling the heat that radiated from her skin. Too hot, still too hot. The fever hadn't broken yet. "I'll be back soon, sweet pea," she whispered. "Mama's going to fix everything, I promise." There was that word again, promise. She was drowning in promises she wasn't sure she could keep. She stood and took one last look around the cabin. There was nothing left to take, nothing left to sell. The bare walls stared back at her accusingly. Once this place had been filled with the modest comforts of a working farm family. Thomas's rifle over the mantel, her mother's china on the shelf, a rag rug on the floor, pictures on the wall. All gone now, all sold, all sacrificed to the great god of survival. The only thing left was a small mirror, cracked and tarnished, hanging beside the door. Clara caught sight of her reflection as she passed and stopped, shocked by what she saw. Who was this woman? This hollow-eyed stranger with sunken cheeks and cracked lips? This woman who looked 50 instead of 32? When had she become so old? When had the light gone out of her eyes? She stared at her reflection, and her reflection stared back, and for a moment Clara felt a wave of grief so profound it threatened to pull her under. She grieved for the woman she'd been, for the life she'd lost, for the future she'd imagined that would never come to pass. Then she pushed the grief down, buried it deep where it couldn't reach her. There was no time for grief, no time for self-pity. There was only forward motion, only survival, only the next step and the step after that. She picked up the scissors. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, longer than it had been in years. Thomas had liked it long. She'd kept it that way for him, even after it became impractical for a farm wife. Now she was glad she had. Long hair was worth more than short hair. Every inch would add to its value. She gathered it at the base of her neck, feeling its weight one last time. Then, before she could change her mind, she cut. The sound of the scissors was shockingly loud in the quiet cabin. Snip, snip, snip. Each cut felt like a small death, a little piece of herself dying and falling away. But she kept cutting, determined and methodical, until her hair lay in a thick bundle in her hands, and her head felt strangely light and cold. She touched the ragged ends that remained, barely brushing her shoulders now. It felt wrong. She felt naked, exposed, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with loss. But she didn't have time to mourn her hair any more than she had time to mourn anything else. She wrapped the cut hair carefully in a piece of cloth, tying it with string, and tucked it into the inside pocket of her shawl where it would stay dry. Then she took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and opened the cabin door. The cold hit her like a physical blow. The blizzard that had raged for days had finally stopped, but the temperature had dropped even further in its wake. The world was white and silent and achingly beautiful in the way that only dangerous things can be beautiful. Snow had drifted against the cabin walls, nearly reaching the windows. The sky was that pale, hard blue that promised more cold to come. 7 miles. She had to walk 7 miles to town in this. Clara closed the door behind her and started walking. The snow came up to her knees in places, and every step was a battle. Her boots, Thomas's old boots really, stuffed with rags to make them fit, were worn thin, and she could feel the cold seeping through the soles. Her shawl provided little protection against the wind that had started to pick up again, whistling through the empty landscape with a sound like mourning. But she kept walking. The homestead disappeared behind her, swallowed by the white landscape. Ahead of her, the trail to town, barely visible under the snow, stretched out endlessly. 7 might as well have been 70. Might as well have been 700. But she kept walking. She thought about Lucy to keep herself moving. Lucy who loved flowers and butterflies and stories about princesses. Lucy who had Thomas's eyes and Clara's stubborn chin. Lucy who deserved so much better than this hard scrabble existence, this constant fight for survival. Thomas had promised Clara a better life when they'd married. He'd been a good man, a kind man, full of dreams about the homestead they would build together. They'd filed their claim with such hope, such optimism, 160 acres of possibility. They'd work hard, raise their family, build something lasting, the American dream right there for the taking. But the American dream, Clara had learned, had sharp teeth and a taste for blood. The land was harder than Thomas had expected. The weather was harsher, the isolation more complete. They'd struggled from the beginning, but they'd been happy anyway, because they'd had each other. And then the influenza came, and in less than a week, Clara's entire world collapsed. She'd tried to keep the farm going by herself, tried and failed. A woman alone couldn't manage a homestead. Not in this country, not in this climate. She needed help, needed hired hands, needed money she didn't have and couldn't get. The crops failed. The few animals they'd had died or had to be sold, and slowly, inexorably, everything fell apart. The only thing that kept her from giving up entirely was Lucy. Lucy who needed her. Lucy who depended on her. Lucy who was the living proof that Thomas had existed. That their love had been real. That this whole terrible struggle meant something. Clara's feet were numb now, and her fingers ached with cold despite being tucked into her armpits for warmth. She'd been walking for hours. How many? She couldn't say. Time had become strange and elastic, stretching and contracting in ways that made no sense. All she knew was that the sun was higher now, though it provided no warmth and the town still wasn't visible on the horizon. Keep walking, just keep walking. Her mind started to drift, the cold and exhaustion pulling her into a strange, dreamlike state. She thought she saw Thomas standing ahead of her on the trail, waving to her, calling her name. She blinked and he was gone. Just another trick of the cold and the snow and her own desperate loneliness. "I'm trying, Thomas," she whispered to the empty air. "I'm trying so hard to take care of her, to take care of our girl. I hope you'd be proud of me. I hope you'd understand what I'm doing, what I'm about to do." The wind was her only answer. Cold and indifferent, she kept walking. By the time she saw the first buildings of town in the distance, Claire's entire body was shaking with cold and exhaustion. Her feet were no longer part of her body. They were distant things moving independently, carrying her forward through sheer momentum. Her face was numb, her hands had curled into claws that she wasn't sure she could straighten, but she'd made it. 7, numb and through the snow and cold, and she'd made it. The town of Red Creek wasn't much. A main street with a handful of buildings, a church, a saloon, a general store, a few houses scattered around the edges. In summer it was dusty and brown. In winter it was white and grey and looked about as welcoming as a grave. But to Clara it looked like salvation. She stumbled down the main street, aware that people were staring at her. She must look like a ghost, wild-eyed and desperate, with her hair chopped short and her clothes covered in snow. Let them stare. She didn't care. She had nothing left to care with except her love for Lucy. And that was focused entirely on the general store at the end of the street. Morrison's General Store. She'd been coming here since she and Thomas first arrived, back when they'd had money to spend. And credit, that was good. Back before everything fell apart. Mr. Morrison had been sympathetic at first, extending credit when he probably shouldn't have. But even sympathy had its limits, and she'd long since reached his. The bell above the door jingled as she pushed her way inside, and the warmth of the store hit her like a wall. She swayed on her feet, dizzy from the sudden temperature change, and had to grab the counter to steady herself. "Mrs. Bennet?" Mr. Morrison looked up from where he'd been stacking cans on a shelf, his round face registering surprise and concern. "Good Lord, woman, what are you doing out in this weather? You look half frozen." Clara opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her throat was too dry, too tight. She swallowed hard and tried again. I have something to trade." Mr. Morrison's expression shifted, becoming wary. He'd probably heard every hard luck story there was, and he ran a business, not a charity. "Mrs. Bennet, I told you last time I can't extend any more credit. I'm sorry, but not credit." Clara's voice was stronger now, though it still shook. "Trade. I have something valuable, something you can sell." She reached into her shawl with trembling fingers and pulled out the bundle of hair. She unwrapped it slowly, carefully, and laid it on the counter between them. For a moment, Mr. Morrison just stared. Then his eyes widened with understanding. "Mrs. Bennet," his voice was soft, almost pitying. "You didn't have to." "How much?" Clara interrupted. She couldn't bear sympathy right now. Sympathy would break her. "How much is it worth?" Mr. Morrison picked up the bundle of hair, running his fingers through it, testing its weight and quality. Clara watched his face, trying to read his expression, trying to guess what he was thinking. Finally, he set it down and looked at her with sad eyes. "It's good quality hair, Mrs. Bennet. Real good quality. In a city, you might get $10, maybe $15 for it. But this isn't a city, and I'm not in the hair business. I'd have to find a buyer. Ship it east. Wait for payment. I could give you $3 for it. Maybe 4. $3. $4. Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. That was it. That was all her hair was worth. $3 or $4 wouldn't buy enough food to last more than a week. Maybe 2 if she was careful. It wouldn't buy medicine. It wouldn't pay the land taxes. It wouldn't save them. "I need more," she heard herself say, and hated how her voice cracked. "I need bread and flour and medicine. My daughter is sick. She has a fever. She needs medicine." "Mrs. Bennet, I'm sorry, but I can't. Please." The word came out as a sob. Clara pressed her hands flat on the counter, leaning forward, all her desperation pouring out in that single word. "Please, I'm begging you. I have nothing else. No money, no credit, nothing to trade, just this hair. And it's not enough. It's not enough. But I need you to help me anyway. Please, for my daughter, please." She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. All her carefully maintained control shattering under the weight of too much loss. Too much struggle, too much everything. She was breaking right here in Morrison's general store, breaking into pieces that she wasn't sure could ever be put back together. Mr. Morrison's face crumpled with pity and discomfort. "Mrs. Bennet, I wish I could help, but I have a business to run. I have my own family to think about. I can't just give away. Not charity, not asking for charity. I'll work, I'll pay you back. That's enough." The voice came from behind her, deep and quiet, and carrying an authority that made both Clara and Mr. Morrison fall silent. Clara turned, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to see who had spoken. A man stood just inside the door, snow-dusting his shoulders and the brim of his hat. He was tall, lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate little, with weather-beaten skin and eyes that were the color of a winter sky. He wore a dusty coat that had seen better days and boots that were worn but well-maintained. A cowboy, Clara thought, a rancher by the look of him. "Elias," Mr. Morrison said, relief evident in his voice. "Didn't hear you come in." The man, Elias, didn't respond to Morrison. His eyes were fixed on Clara, studying her with an intensity that made her want to shrink back. But she was too tired to shrink, too tired to do anything but stand there and let him look. "How much does she need?" Elias asked, still looking at Clara but speaking to Morrison. What?" "The lady. How much does she need to feed herself and her child? To buy medicine to get through the winter?" Clara found her voice. "I'm not asking for your charity, sir. Didn't say you were." Elias finally looked away from her and turned to Morrison. "How much?" Morrison stammered, clearly uncomfortable. "Well, I medicine for the child would be about $2. Flour, cornmeal, some bacon, dried beans, maybe coffee. I'd say another $10 would get them supplied for a few weeks. But Elias, you can't just I can do what I want with my money." Elias's voice was mild, but there was steel underneath it. He pulled a leather billfold from his coat pocket and counted out bills, laying them on the counter with deliberate care. "Give her what she needs, everything on the list you just said, plus whatever else you think would help, and had some candy for the child." "Elias, do it, Morrison." Clara stared at the money on the counter, at this stranger who had just walked in and solved her immediate problem as easily as breathing. Her mind couldn't process it. This didn't happen. People didn't just help. Not without expecting something in return, not in this harsh world where everyone was fighting their own battle for survival. "I can't accept this," she said, even as every fiber of her being screamed at her to take it to grab the money and the food and run before he changed his mind. "I don't even know you. Name's Elias Ward. I have a ranch about 15 mi north of here, and you can accept it because I'm not offering charity." "Then what are you offering?" He turned those winter sky eyes on her again, and for the first time Clara saw something in them that might have been sympathy or understanding or something else she couldn't name. "A job. I need a cook for the winter. Someone to manage the house, prepare meals, keep things running while me and my hands work the ranch. Pay would be 50 cents a day, plus room and board for you and your child. The money I just put down," he nodded toward the counter. "Consider it an advance on your wages." Claire's breath caught in her throat. A job, room and board, steady pay. It was more than she dared hope for, more than she'd even allowed herself to dream about. But there was always a catch. There had to be a catch. Why? The question came out sharper than she intended. "Why would you do this? You don't know me. You don't know if I can even cook. Why would you offer this to a complete stranger?" Something flickered across Elias's face, a shadow of old pain maybe, or old memory. When he spoke, his voice was quieter, almost gentle. "Let's just say I know what it's like to watch someone you love go hungry. And I know what it's like when nobody helps. Now, do you want the job or not?" Clara looked at him, really looked at him, trying to see past the weathered face and quiet demeanor to whatever truth lay beneath. She saw nothing but sincerity in those eyes. Nothing but an offer freely given with no strings she could detect. And even if there were strings, even if this was some kind of trap or trick or test, what choice did she have? Lucy needed medicine. They needed food. They needed a warm place to stay while the winter raged outside. She needed this. "Yes," she said, and felt something shift inside her chest. Hope, maybe, or just the absence of despair, which was almost the same thing. Yes, I'll take the job. Elias nodded once, as if that settled everything. Good, Morrison, get her supplies packed up. I'll take her and the child out to the ranch today before the next storm hits today. Clara felt panic rise in her chest. I need to go back to my cabin first. My daughter is sick and needs medicine, which we have now, and needs warmth, which your cabin doesn't have. If I'm guessing right about your situation. Elias's voice was firm, but not unkind. We'll ride back to your place, get your daughter and whatever possessions you want to bring, and head to the ranch before dark. That worked for you. It worked for her. God help her. It worked for her. Even though she was putting her trust in a stranger, even though she was leaving the last remnant of the life she'd built with Thomas, even though she had no idea if this was salvation or something else entirely. It works, she whispered. Then let's get moving. Elias turned to Morrison. Have everything ready in an hour. I'll be back with my wagon. He touched the brim of his hat to Clara, a small gesture of respect that nearly undid her, and walked out into the cold. Clara stood in the warm store, surrounded by shelves full of food she could now afford, holding a bundle of cut hair that she no longer needed to sell, and felt tears streaming down her face again. But these tears were different. These tears were something she hadn't felt in so long she barely recognized the emotion. Relief? Pure, overwhelming relief. Mr. Morrison cleared his throat awkwardly. Well, then let's get you sorted out, Mrs. Bennet. You said your daughter needs medicine. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. Right then. Morrison moved behind the counter with new purpose, pulling bottles from shelves, measuring out portions. I've got fever medicine here, good stuff, and I'll add some willow bark tea. That'll help bring the fever down. Now for food, I'm thinking. Clara half listened as Morrison talked, making decisions about flour and bacon and beans. Her mind was elsewhere, caught between disbelief and this strange, fragile hope that had taken root in her chest. Who was Elias Ward? Why had he helped her? And what would life be like on his ranch, cooking for cowboys and cattle hands, trying to rebuild some semblance of normalcy while her world was still so shattered? She didn't have answers to any of these questions. All she had was the decision she'd made, the path she'd chosen because it was the only path available. And as she stood there in Morrison's general store, feeling warmth seep back into her frozen body, she made herself a new promise. Not the desperate promises of the night before, but something stronger, something real. She would survive this. She and Lucy both. They would survive this winter and whatever came after. They would survive because they had to. Because giving up wasn't an option. Because somewhere deep inside her, buried under all the grief and fear and exhaustion, there was still a kernel of strength that refused to die. She touched her short hair, feeling the ragged ends, mourning briefly for what she'd lost. Then she straightened her shoulders and turned her attention to Mr. Morrison's list of supplies, to the practical matters of survival that would carry her through the next hour and the next day, and all the days that followed. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows of the general store. But inside, Clara Bennet stood in the warmth and made plans for a future she couldn't quite imagine yet, but was determined to reach anyway. The scissors gleamed on the counter where she'd left them, a reminder of what she'd been willing to sacrifice, but she didn't need them anymore. She had something better now. She had a chance. The wagon lurched over a hidden rut in the snowpack trail, and Clara instinctively tightened her grip on the wooden seat. Beside her, Elias Ward handled the reins with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent more of his life on horseback than on foot, his eyes scanning the white landscape ahead with the practiced vigilance of someone who knew these plains could turn deadly without warning. Behind them, wrapped in every blanket Morrison had been able to spare, Lucy lay in the wagon bed, surrounded by sacks of flour and crates of supplies. Clara turned every few minutes to check on her daughter, watching the shallow rise and fall of her chest, listening for any change in her labored breathing. The fever medicine Morrison had given them was already tucked safely in Claire's pocket, waiting for the moment they could stop and administer it properly. They'd left Red Creek an hour ago, after Elias had returned with his wagon, and helped load the supplies with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. He hadn't pressed her with questions or small talk, for which Clara was grateful. She didn't have the energy for pleasantries, for the social niceties that belonged to a world where women didn't have to cut off their hair to feed their children. The journey back to the cabin took half the time it had taken Clara to walk that morning. What had been an endless trudge through knee-deep snow became a manageable ride, though the cold was no less bitter and the wind no less cruel. Clara found herself studying Elias from the corner of her eye, trying to understand this stranger who had so casually upended her life. He was older than she'd first thought, probably in his early 40s, though the harsh Colorado sun and wind made it hard to tell. His face was lined and weathered, the face of a man who worked outdoors in all seasons and all weather. But there was something in the set of his jaw, something in the way he held himself that suggested strength beyond the merely physical. This was a man who'd survived his own share of hardships and come out the other side still standing. "Your ranch," Clara finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, hollow from cold and crying. "How many hands do you employ?" "4 through the winter, more in spring and summer." Elias kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "It's not a big operation. About 500 head of cattle, some horses, enough to make a living." 500 head? That was more than enough to make a living. That was prosperity by the standards of this territory. Clara felt a flutter of something in her chest. Not quite hope, but perhaps the shadow of it. A man with a ranch that size could afford to pay her wages, could afford to keep his promises. "And they all need feeding," she said. 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. Now Elias did glance at her, and there might have been the ghost of a smile in his eyes. "Think you can manage that?" Clara thought of the meals she'd prepared over the years, the bread she'd baked, the stews she'd simmered, the pies she'd made from whatever fruit she could forage or afford. She'd fed Thomas and Lucy on next to nothing, making meals from scraps and determination, feeding cowboys with actual supplies to work with. That would be easy by comparison. "I can manage," she said, and was pleased to hear her voice come out steady and certain. They rode in silence for a while longer. The landscape rolled past, endless white broken only by the occasional dark shape of a tree or rock formation. It was beautiful in its way, this winter wilderness. But it was a beauty that killed without remorse. Clara had learned to respect it, to fear it, to understand that survival here meant constant vigilance and the willingness to do whatever was necessary. "There," she said finally, pointing ahead to where her cabin sat, hunched against the cold, nearly buried in snowdrifts. "That's my place." Elias pulled the wagon to a stop and studied the homestead with an expression Clara couldn't read. She tried to see it through his eyes and felt shame burn hot in her chest. The cabin was barely standing, its roof sagging under the weight of snow, its walls gap-toothed with missing chinking. The barn had partially collapsed last month, and she hadn't had the strength or materials to repair it. The whole place looked like what it was, the last gasp of a dying dream. "I know it's not much," she said, defensive despite herself. "It's a hard land for anyone to work alone," Elias said quietly. "No shame in that." But there was shame. Clara felt it settle on her shoulders like another burden, another weight to carry. Thomas had worked himself to death, trying to make this place succeed, and she'd watched helplessly as everything they'd built crumbled to dust. There was shame in failure, no matter how inevitable it had been. Elias climbed down from the wagon and came around to help Clara down. His hands were strong and steady as he gripped her waist, lifting her easily to the ground. For just a moment, Clara was aware of how long it had been since anyone had touched her with such casual kindness, and the awareness made her throat tight. "I'll see to your daughter," he said. "You gather whatever you want to bring. Don't take long. We need to reach the ranch before dark." Clara nodded and hurried toward the cabin, her feet crunching in the snow. Inside, the cold hit her like a slap. Without a fire, the cabin was barely warmer than the outdoors. She moved quickly, gathering what little she had left. Her mother's shawl already around her shoulders. A few pieces of clothing, the cracked mirror by the door, because it had been her mother's too. A photograph of Thomas, stiff and formal in his wedding suit, looking young and hopeful and alive. She stood for a moment, holding the photograph, letting herself remember. Thomas laughing at something she'd said. Thomas teaching Lucy to count by pointing at stars. Thomas sleeping beside her on cold winter nights. His warmth, a comfort, and a promise that they'd face whatever came together. But Thomas was gone, and promises died with the people who made them. Clara wrapped the photograph carefully in a piece of cloth and added it to her small bundle. Then she took one last look around the cabin that had been her home, her prison, her battlefield for the past 6 months. Goodbye, she whispered to the empty room, to the ghost of the life she tried to build here. Then she turned and walked out, closing the door behind her with a finality that felt like an ending and a beginning all at once. Outside, Elias had Lucy in his arms, wrapped so completely in blankets that only her small, fevered face was visible. He'd moved with a gentleness Clara hadn't expected, and Lucy, who usually cried around strangers, was staring up at him with solemn, glassy eyes. "Mama." Lucy's voice was barely a whisper. "Right here, sweet pea." Clara hurried to them, touching her daughter's hot forehead. "We're going somewhere warm, somewhere with food and medicine. You're going to be all right. Is Papa there?" Lucy asked, and Clara's heart broke all over again. "No, darling. Papa's in heaven, remember? But this kind man is going to help us. His name is Mr. Ward." "Elias," he corrected quietly. "Just Elias." He looked down at Lucy with something in his eyes that might have been memory or pain. "You look like you could use some hot soup in a warm bed, little miss. Think you can hold on a bit longer?" Lucy nodded, and Elias carried her to the wagon, settling her back among the blankets with a care that made Clara's eyes sting with unshed tears. Who was this man? What had happened in his life to make him capable of such unexpected kindness? The journey to Elias's ranch took another 2 hours, and by the time they arrived, the sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. The ranch appeared gradually. First a line of fence posts, then the dark shapes of outbuildings, and finally the house itself. Clara felt her breath catch. This wasn't the rough cabin she'd been expecting. This was a real house, 2 stories tall, built from good timber that had been properly chinkicked and painted white. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys, promising warmth. A barn stood solid and intact, much larger than the one Thomas had built. Beyond it, she could see fenced pastures and the dark shapes of cattle huddled against the cold. This was success. This was what Thomas had dreamed of achieving, what he died trying to build. And Clara was arriving here as an employee, a cook hired to feed other people's dreams. The bitterness of it nearly choked her. "Welcome to the Ward Ranch," Elias said, pulling the wagon to a stop near the front porch. "It's not fancy, but it's warm and solid." Before Clara could respond, the front door burst open and a young man emerged, probably no more than 20, with a shock of red hair and a face full of freckles. Behind him came 3 other men, all dressed in the rough work clothes of ranch hands, all looking curious and slightly wary. "Boss," the red-haired man called, "didn't expect you back so soon." "Who?" He stopped when he saw Clara and Lucy, his expression shifting from curiosity to confusion. "Tommy, help me get the supplies unloaded," Elias said, climbing down from the wagon. "Mrs. Bennett and her daughter will be staying with us. Mrs. Bennett is our new cook." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions. Clara felt 4 pairs of eyes studying her, judging her, wondering about her. She lifted her chin and met their stares with as much dignity as she could muster, which wasn't much given that she was half frozen, tear-stained, and desperate. "This is Tommy," Elias continued, gesturing to the red-haired man, "and that's Pete, Jake, and Sam." He pointed to each man in turn. Pete, older and gay-bearded, Jake, dark-haired and suspicious-looking, and Sam, young and lean with kind eyes. "Boys, this is Mrs. Clara Bennett and her daughter Lucy. You'll treat them with respect, or you'll answer to me. Understood?" A chorus of yes, boss followed, and Clara felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Whatever else Elias Ward might be, he clearly commanded respect from his men. That was something. "Now get those supplies inside before they freeze," Elias ordered. "Mrs. Bennett, let's get your daughter into the warm." Clara followed him into the house, and the wave of heat that greeted her was so intense she almost staggered. A large fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, flames crackling cheerfully. The room was simply furnished, but clean, with a long wooden table, several chairs, and a few worn but comfortable-looking couches. Stairs led up to what she assumed were bedrooms. "Lucy needs medicine," Clara said, finding her voice, "and something hot to drink if you have it. Upstairs. First door on the right. That'll be your room." Elias was already moving toward the stairs. Lucy still cradled in his arms. "I'll get her settled while you warm up. Kitchen's through there." He nodded toward a doorway. "Make yourself at home. Make yourself at home." The words echoed strangely in Clara's ears. This wasn't her home. This was a workplace, a temporary refuge, a stopping point on a journey to somewhere else. Though where that somewhere else might be, she had no idea. But she followed Elias upstairs anyway, through a hallway lined with closed doors to a room that was larger than her entire cabin had been. A real bed dominated the space with a thick mattress and quilts that looked warm enough to survive a blizzard. A dresser stood against one wall, a washstand against another. A smaller bed had been pushed into the corner, perfect size for Lucy. "It's not much," Elias said, laying Lucy gently on the small bed. "But it's warm and dry. That's what matters." "Not much?" Clara wanted to laugh. This room alone was luxury beyond anything she'd known in months. Instead, she just nodded and moved to her daughter's side, pulling the medicine from her pocket with shaking hands. "Thank you," she managed. "For all of this, I can't." "No need for thanks. You'll earn your keep soon enough." Elias moved toward the door, then paused. "There's water heating on the stove downstairs. Get your daughter settled. Get warm, and when you're ready, come down and I'll show you the kitchen. No rush. Take the time you need." Then he was gone, closing the door quietly behind him, leaving Clara alone with Lucy in this strange room that smelled of cedar and linseed oil and hope. Clara's hand shook as she measured out the medicine Morrison had given her. The instructions were simple enough, 1 spoonful every 4 hours until the fever broke. She held Lucy's head up gently, coaxing her to swallow the bitter liquid, murmuring encouragement when her daughter whimpered. "There's my brave girl," Claire whispered. "That's going to make you feel better, I promise." There was that word again. Promise. But this time Clara thought maybe she could keep it. She spent the next hour tending to Lucy, wiping her fevered face with cool water from the washstand, changing her into the cleanest nightgown they owned, settling her under quilts that were softer than anything Lucy had ever felt. Gradually, her daughter's breathing eased and she drifted into sleep, real sleep, not the fever, restless tossing that had terrified Clara for days. Only when she was certain Lucy was resting comfortably did Clara allow herself to sink into the chair by the window and let the events of the day wash over her. This morning she'd been preparing to cut off her hair and walk 7 miles through a blizzard, not knowing if she'd find salvation or just another closed door. Now she was here in a warm room with medicine for her child and the promise of steady work. It felt like a dream, a strange, impossible dream that might evaporate if she looked at it too closely. Through the window, she could see the sun setting over the snow-covered plains, turning the world into a canvas of orange and purple and gold. Beautiful, deadly, unforgiving. This was Colorado, and it gave nothing freely. Every blessing came with a price, every bit of good fortune with strings attached. What would the price be here? What strings would she find attached to Elias Ward's generosity? Clara stood and studied her reflection in the wash mirror. Her short hair was a shock. She looked like a different person, someone harder and older than the woman who'd stood in her cabin yesterday. But maybe that was appropriate. Maybe she was a different person. Maybe Clara Bennett, the homesteader's wife, had died along with Thomas, and this was someone new, someone who could survive in a harsher world on harsher terms. She tidied herself as best she could, washing her face and hands, straightening her worn dress, trying to look like someone capable of managing a kitchen and feeding ranch hands. Then, with one last glance at Lucy to make sure she was still sleeping peacefully, Clara made her way downstairs. The main room was busier now. The 4 ranch hands sat around the long table, playing cards and talking in low voices that stopped abruptly when Clara appeared. She felt their eyes on her again, curious and assessing. "Mrs. Bennett." Elias stood from where he'd been adding wood to the fire. "Your daughter's sleeping. The medicine seems to be helping already." "Good, that's good." He gestured toward the doorway he'd indicated earlier. "Let me show you the kitchen." Clara followed him through to a room that made her breath catch. The kitchen was large and well equipped with a massive cast-iron stove, shelves lined with pots and pans, a worked in the center, and a pantry whose door stood open to reveal shelves stocked with supplies. This was a kitchen designed for serious cooking, for feeding large numbers of people, for someone who knew what they were doing. The last cook left about a month ago, Elias explained, moving around the space with the careful steps of someone who didn't quite belong there. Said the isolation got to him. Since then, we've been taking turns at cooking, and let me tell you, nobody's been happy about it. The boys can burn water if you give them a chance. Clara allowed herself a small smile at that. I'm sure they're not that bad. You haven't tasted Tommy's biscuits yet, harder than rocks and twice as indigestible. Elias opened the pantry wider. Morrison delivered supplies once a month, but I had him add extra to today's order. Figured you'd need to assess what's here and what else you might need. You know what you're doing with all this. Did she know what she was doing? Clara had been cooking since she was old enough to reach a stove. First, helping her mother and then running her own kitchen. She'd made meals from nothing, from scraps and hope and whatever she could grow or hunt or forage. She'd fed her family on pennies and pride. This kitchen, with its abundance of supplies and quality equipment, was more than she dared dream of working with. I know what I'm doing, she said, and meant it. Then it's all yours. Elias stepped back. Breakfast is at sunrise, lunch at noon, dinner at 6 go. The boys eat a lot. They work hard. Nothing fancy required, just good, solid food. Can you start tomorrow? Tomorrow. Could she start tomorrow? Clara looked around the kitchen again, her mind already working through possibilities. She could make biscuits, real biscuits. Not the hard lumps Elias had described. Bacon and eggs, coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Stew for lunch, maybe, using the beef she'd seen in the pantry. Roast for dinner with potatoes and gravy and vegetables, if there were any to be had. I can start tonight, she heard herself say. Your men haven't had dinner yet, have they? Elias stared at her. Mrs. Bennet, you just arrived. You've had a long day. Nobody expects I'm not cooking because anyone expects it. I'm cooking because that's the job you hired me for, and I don't take wages for work I haven't done. Clara moved to the pantry, already taking inventory. Besides, it'll be good to get a feel for the kitchen, see what I have to work with, and I'm betting your men would appreciate a decent meal tonight instead of whatever burnt offering they were planning. For the first time, Clara saw something that might have been a real smile cross Elias's face. You're probably right about that. All right, if you're sure, but keep it simple tonight. No need to prove anything. But there was a need to prove something, Clara thought as Elias left her alone in the kitchen. She needed to prove she could do this job, needed to prove she was worth the money he'd advanced her, worth the risk he'd taken on her and Lucy, needed to prove to herself that she was still capable of something beyond mere survival. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. The kitchen came alive under her hands. She found flour and lard and made biscuit dough, her fingers remembering the familiar motions even after months of barely having ingredients to practice with. She found a ham in the pantry and sliced thick pieces for frying. She made gravy, creamy and rich. She even found a jar of preserved peaches, a luxury she hadn't tasted in forever, and decided the men deserved something sweet after whatever they'd been suffering through. As she worked, Clara felt something inside her begin to settle. This was familiar territory. This was something she was good at, something she could control. In a life that had spiraled so far beyond her control that felt like a lifeline. The smells of cooking began to drift through the house. Clara heard the card game in the next room stop, heard low voices discussing the unlikely possibility of a real meal. She smiled to herself and kept working, adding salt to the gravy, checking the biscuits, making sure everything was perfect. When she finally carried the first platter to the dining table, the 4 ranch hands stared at it like she'd performed a miracle. When she brought out the biscuits, still steaming, Tommy actually groaned. "Mom," he said reverently, "if those taste half as good as they smell, you might be an angel." "They taste better," Clara said with more confidence than she felt. "And I'm no angel, just a cook. Now eat before it gets cold." She didn't sit with them. Didn't feel like it was her place, but she stood in the kitchen doorway and watched as they tore into the food with the enthusiasm of men who'd been living on burnt offerings for too long. Their reactions, the groans of appreciation, the request for seconds, the way Tommy clutched a biscuit like it was made of gold, filled something in Clara that had been empty for too long. This was her value. This was what she could offer. It wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, but it was something real, something tangible, something that mattered. Elias came to the kitchen after the meal carrying plates to wash. Clara moved to take them from him, but he shook his head. "You cooked. I can clean up." "That's not the deal," he finished. "I know, but you've done enough for one day. More than enough. The boys are singing your praises in there." I think Tommy might actually be crying into his third biscuit. Clara felt her cheeks warm with something that might have been pleasure or embarrassment or both. They were just hungry. They were starving, and not just for food. You gave them something to look forward to. Elias set the plates in the washing basin and turned to face her fully. "You did good, Clara. Real good." It was the first time he'd used her first name, and the intimacy of it made her throat tight. "Thank you," she managed. "For everything, for the job, for helping Lucy, for all of it. Like I said before, no thanks necessary, you'll earn your keep." Elias paused, studying her with those winter sky eyes. "But I want you to understand something. This job is real. The wages are real. You're not charity, and you're not a burden. You're a member of this household now, and that comes with certain protections. Nobody here will disrespect you or your daughter. Nobody will question your presence or make you feel unwelcome. And if they do, they answer to me. Understood?" Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. "Good. Now go check on your daughter and get some rest. Tomorrow's soon enough to start worrying about breakfast." Clara climbed the stairs slowly, exhaustion finally catching up with her. In her room, Lucy was still sleeping peacefully, her forehead noticeably cooler than it had been hours before. Clara touched her daughter's face gently, marveling at the difference the medicine had already made, at how much had changed in the space of a single day. This morning, she'd been ready to sell pieces of herself for survival. Tonight she had a job, a warm room, and hope for the first time in 6 months. It seemed impossible. It seemed like the kind of thing that happened in fairy tales, not in the hard reality of Colorado Territory in 1876. But it was real. She was here. Lucy was healing, and tomorrow she'd wake up and cook breakfast for Cowboys, and that would be the start of something new. Clara changed into her nightgown and climbed into the real bed with its thick mattress and warm quilts. She pulled Lucy close, breathing in the scent of her daughter's hair, listening to her peaceful breathing, and let herself cry one more time, not from despair this time, but from relief so profound it felt like breaking. They'd survived against all odds. Against everything the world had thrown at them, they'd survived. And maybe, just maybe, they'd do more than survive. Maybe they'd actually live again. Through the window, stars began to appear in the darkening sky, cold and distant, but beautiful nonetheless. Clara watched them until her eyes grew heavy and sleep finally claimed her, pulling her down into dreams that were for the first time in months not nightmares, but something softer, something that might have been hope. Dawn came early on the Ward ranch, announced by the crow of a rooster and the sound of boots on wooden floors. Clara woke to pale light filtering through the window and the momentary disorientation of not knowing where she was. Then memory flooded back. The journey, the kitchen, the warm bed. And she sat up quickly, her heart pounding with the sudden fear that it had all been a dream. But Lucy was there beside her, sleeping peacefully, her fever finally broken. The quilts were real, the solid walls around them were real, and downstairs, Clara could hear the low murmur of men's voices waiting for breakfast. Her first real day of work. She dressed quickly in the dim light, braiding her short hair. Such a strange sensation, not having the weight of it down her back anymore and checking her reflection in the small mirror. The woman who looked back at her still seemed like a stranger, gaunt and tired. But there was something different in her eyes this morning. Purpose, maybe, or just the absence of that crushing despair that had shadowed her for so long. Lucy stirred as Clara moved about the room. "Mama, right here, sweet pea." Clara sat on the edge of the bed, touching her daughter's forehead. Cool. Thank God. Still cool. How do you feel? Hungry. Lucy's voice was stronger than it had been in days, and Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the simple, beautiful normally of that word. That's my girl. That's wonderful. You stay here and rest a bit more, and I'll bring you up some breakfast soon. All right. Where are we? Lucy looked around the unfamiliar room with wide eyes. This isn't our house. No, darling, this is we're going to be staying here for a while at Mr. Ward's ranch. Mama has a job now, cooking for the Cowboys. Isn't that exciting? Lucy considered this with the seriousness only a 5-year-old could muster. Will there be horses? Clara laughed, the sound rusty from disuse, but genuine. I imagine so. Lots of them. Can I see them? When you're stronger, for now, you need to rest and get better. Promise me you'll stay in bed while Mama works. I promise. Lucy snuggled back into the quilts, and Clara kissed her forehead before heading downstairs. The kitchen was cold when she entered it, the stove's fire having died overnight. Clara set to work immediately, building up the fire, filling the coffee pot with water from the pump by the sink, pulling out flour and eggs, and the leftover ham from last night. Her hands moved automatically, following patterns established over years of cooking, while her mind raced ahead to all the meals she'd need to prepare, all the ways she'd need to prove her worth. She was rolling out biscuit dough when Elias appeared in the doorway, looking like he'd already been up for hours. His hair was damp, probably from washing at the pump outside, and he carried with him the smell of cold air and horses. "You're up early," he said. "So are you." Clara didn't look up from her work, concentrating on cutting perfect circles from the dough. What time do the men usually eat? Whenever something edible appears, which hasn't been often lately, Elias moved into the kitchen, pouring himself coffee from the pot that was already beginning to perk. Your daughter better. The fever broke. Clara couldn't keep the relief from her voice. She's awake and asking about horses. Something that might have been approval crossed Elias's face. Good sign. Kids asking questions usually means they're on the mend. He sipped his coffee and grimaced. This is terrible. It hasn't finished brewing yet. Clara finally looked up, allowing herself a small smile. Give it a few more minutes. Ah, that explains it. He leaned against the counter, watching her work with an attention that made Clara self-conscious. You always wake up this early. Farm wife's habit. Hard to break. Clara slid the biscuits into the oven and started cracking eggs into a bowl. Besides, can't let the men starve their first morning with a real cook. They'd never let me live it down. True enough. Tommy's already been asking when breakfast might appear. I think he's having dreams about those biscuits from last night. They fell into a comfortable silence, broken only by the sounds of cooking and the coffee pot bubbling. Claire was aware of Elias's presence in a way that felt strange and new. It had been so long since she'd shared space with a man, since she'd been conscious of masculine energy in a kitchen that had been her domain alone. But there was nothing threatening about Elias's presence. He simply stood there drinking his terrible too-early coffee, watching her cook with an expression she couldn't quite read. Can I ask you something? Clara said finally, whisking eggs with more force than necessary. You can ask. Yesterday in town. Why did you help me? She kept her eyes on the eggs, not brave enough to look at him directly. You said something about your mother, but there's more to it, isn't there? Nobody just offers a job to a complete stranger out of the goodness of their heart. Not in this country. The silence stretched long enough that Clara thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, rougher than she'd heard it before. My mother was widowed when I was 12. My father died in a mining accident, and the company that owned the mine didn't give her a penny. No compensation, no pension, nothing. Just a body to bury and 3 boys to feed. Elias set his coffee cup down carefully. She tried everything, took in washing, did mending, cleaned houses, but it wasn't enough, never enough. I watched her starve herself so me and my brothers could eat. Watched her work herself sick trying to keep us alive. Claire stopped whisking and turned to look at him. His face was carefully neutral, but she could see old pain in the set of his shoulders, in the way his hands gripped the counter edge. What happened? She asked softly. She got pneumonia, died when I was 14. The words came out flat, emotionless, but Clara heard the weight beneath them. After that, me and my brother scattered. Did whatever we could to survive. I worked ranches, cattle drives, anything that paid, saved every penny, spent 20 years building this place from nothing. He finally met her eyes. So when I saw you in Morrison's store, desperate enough to sell your hair, I saw my mother and I couldn't walk away. Not again. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Clara felt something shift in her understanding of this man. He wasn't just being kind, he was trying to rewrite an old story, trying to give someone else the help his mother had never received. "I'm sorry," she said, knowing the words were inadequate, but offering them anyway. "I'm sorry for what happened to your mother, and I'm grateful, more grateful than I can say for what you're doing for me and Lucy. I won't let you down, I know you won't." Elias pushed away from the counter. "I better go tell the boys breakfast is coming before Tommy breaks down the door." He paused at the doorway. "Clara, your hair. It'll grow back, but keep the scissors away for a while. You've given up enough already." Then he was gone, leaving Clara alone with her eggs and her thoughts and a new understanding of the man who'd saved her life. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Clara rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, spending her mornings in the warm kitchen while the men went about their work. She cooked 3 substantial meals a day, baked bread, made coffee strong enough to fuel a full day of ranch work. In the afternoons, she cleaned the house, mended clothes, and tended to Lucy, who grew stronger by the day. It was hard work, but it was good work. Purposeful work. The kind of work that left Clara tired at the end of the day, but satisfied in a way she hadn't felt since Thomas died. She was earning her keep, proving her value, building something that felt almost like a life again. Lucy, freed from her sick bed after the first week, became the ranch's unofficial mascot. The little girl followed the cowboys around like a devoted shadow, asking endless questions and offering her opinions on everything from the proper way to brush a horse to the best kind of cloud. The men, rough as they were, treated her with surprising gentleness. Tommy especially seemed to have adopted Lucy as a sort of little sister. Clara would often look out the kitchen window to see the tall redhead patiently showing Lucy how to feed chickens or letting her help with simple chores that probably took twice as long with her assistance. But he never complained, never showed anything but patience with the curious child. "Your girl's got spirit," Pete told Clara one evening as she served dinner. The older man had been quiet at first, watching Clara with suspicious eyes, but he'd warmed to her over the weeks. "Reminds me of my own granddaughter back in Missouri." "You have family in Missouri?" Clara asked, setting down a platter of roasted venison. "Had wife passed 10 years ago, daughter got married and moved east. Haven't seen them in 5 years." Pete's weathered face creased with old sorrow. "This ranch life, it's not for everyone. Gets lonely." Clara understood loneliness. She understood it in her bones in the cold, empty places where Thomas used to be. But here, surrounded by these rough men and their simple kindnesses, the loneliness felt less sharp somehow, less all-consuming. "You should write to them," she said impulsively. "I could help if you need it. Maybe they'd come visit in the spring." Pete looked up at her with something like hope in his eyes. "You think? I think family matters, and I think spring is a time for new beginnings." Clara smiled. Can't hurt to ask. That night, after the dishes were washed and the men had retreated to the bunkhouse, Clara sat at the kitchen table with Pete and helped him compose a letter to his daughter. His handwriting was shaky, his spelling creative, but the love in his words was unmistakable. When they finished, Pete clutched the letter like it was precious. "Thank you, Mom," he said gruffly. "This means, well, it means something." After he left, Clara sat alone in the quiet kitchen, listening to the house settle around her. Upstairs, Lucy was sleeping peacefully. In the next room, she could hear Elias moving around, the creak of floorboards and the rustle of papers that suggested he was working on the ranch accounts, the sounds of life, of a household functioning, of people existing together in relative harmony. It was more than she'd dared hope for. Winter deepened as January gave way to February. The snow piled higher, the temperatures dropped lower, and the world outside became a white wasteland where nothing moved except the wind. But inside the ranch house, life continued with surprising warmth. Clara's cooking improved as she grew more familiar with the kitchen and the men's preferences. She made hearty stews that stuck to ribs, biscuits that Tommy declared were better than his mama's, though he'd deny it if anyone told her, and pies from dried fruit that disappeared almost faster than she could make them. She learned that Jake didn't like onions, that Sam had a sweet tooth he tried to hide, that Pete's teeth troubled him with anything too tough, that Tommy could eat his weight in potatoes and still ask for more. And Elias, she learned about Elias in quiet moments and careful observation. Learned that he was always the first one up and the last to bed. That he worked twice as hard as any of his men, but never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. That he was fair, but firm, generous, but not foolish, kind, but not soft. She learned that he sang sometimes when he thought no one could hear old cowboy ballads in a surprisingly good baritone. That he liked his coffee black and strong enough to strip paint. That he read books by lamplight when the work was done, actual books with cloth covers that he kept on a shelf in his room. That he never talked about himself unless directly asked, but he listened when others talked, really listened in a way that made people feel heard. And she learned that he watched her sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking. Watched her with an expression that was part curiosity, part something else she didn't dare name. It was confusing and complicated and probably inappropriate given that she was his employee. But Clara couldn't quite bring herself to ignore it, because the truth was she found herself watching him too. Found herself noticing the way his hands moved when he worked with the horses, gentle and sure. Found herself listening for his footsteps in the morning, for the sound of his voice talking to the men. Found herself thinking about the story he told her, about his mother, about the grief that had shaped him into this man who helped strangers. She told herself it was gratitude, just gratitude for everything he'd done for her and Lucy. Nothing more complicated than that, but late at night, lying in her bed while Lucy slept beside her, Clara couldn't quite convince herself that was all it was. One morning in late February, Clara woke to an unusual silence. No roosters crow, no sounds of movement from below, just an eerie quiet that made her uneasy. She rose and went to the window, pulling back the curtain to look outside. The world had disappeared under snow. Not just regular snow, but a blizzard that must have blown in during the night, piling drifts so high they reached the first-floor windows. The wind howled like a living thing, driving snow horizontally across the landscape and making it impossible to see more than a few feet. "Mama." Lucy sat up, rubbing her eyes. "What's that sound?" "A storm, sweet pea. A big one. We're going to stay inside today." "All right." Clara dressed quickly and hurried downstairs, where she found Elias already at the window, staring out at the blizzard with a grim expression. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Bad. The boys are snowed into the bunkhouse. I can barely see it from here. The cattle," he shook his head, "the cattle are on their own until this blows over. Nothing we can do for them in this. Will they be all right? The ones that find shelter, maybe the rest." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Clara understood the brutal mathematics of ranching in winter. Every blizzard meant losses. Every storm meant calculating how many head of cattle you could afford to lose and still survive. "I'll make coffee," she said, because it was all she could offer. They spent that day trapped inside while the blizzard raged. Claire cooked, trying to keep the kitchen warm and welcoming despite the storm's fury. Lucy played quietly with a rag doll Tommy had made for her, occasionally going to the window to watch the snow with wide eyes, and Elias paced, moving from window to window, checking on the bunkhouse, on the barn, on what little he could see of his ranch being buried under white. By afternoon, the storm had intensified. The wind screamed around the house, rattling windows and finding every crack in the walls. The temperature inside dropped, despite the fires Clara kept burning, and when the sun began to set, not that they could see it through the blizzard, Elias made a decision. "I need to check on the boys," he said, pulling on his heavy coat. "Make sure they have enough wood, enough food. You can't go out in that." Clara moved to block his path without thinking. "You'll freeze to death before you make it 50 FT. I know where the bunkhouse is. I can follow the fence line, and if you lose the fence line, if you get turned around." Clara heard her voice rising with panic. "Elias, please. They're grown men. They'll be fine until the storm passes." And if the bunkhouse roof collapses under the weight of the snow, if the stove goes out and they freeze? He met her eyes and she saw the weight of responsibility there. They're my men, my responsibility. You can't help them if you're dead. Clara grabbed his arm, feeling the solid warmth of him through the coat. Please, just wait a few more hours. If the storm lessens at all, then go. But not now, not in this. They stood there, her hand on his arm, eyes locked, while the storm howled around them. Clara was aware of how close they were standing, aware of her heart pounding in her chest, aware that this felt like something more than an argument about safety. "All right," Elias said finally, his voice rough. "A few more hours, but if this doesn't let up by dark, I'm going anyway. Then I'm going with you." "The hell you are." "Watch your language. My daughter's upstairs." Clara lifted her chin stubbornly. "And I'm serious. If you're fool enough to go out in a blizzard, you're not doing it alone. Someone needs to be able to follow your trail back if you collapse. Clara, don't clar me. This is non-negotiable. Either we both stay inside like sensible people, or we both go out like fools. Choose." A muscle worked in Elias's jaw, then, to Clara's surprise, he laughed. A short, sharp sound that held equal parts frustration and something that might have been admiration. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met." "I'll take that as a compliment." Claire released his arm and stepped back, trying to calm her racing heart. "Now take off that coat and sit down. I'll make you something hot to drink." The storm blew itself out sometime after midnight. Clara knew because she was still awake, lying in bed, listening to the wind gradually lose its fury. When silence finally fell, it was profound and complete. The kind of silence that only comes after a blizzard, when the world is buried and muffled and hushed. In the morning, they emerged to a landscape transformed. Snow had drifted so high against the house that they had to dig out the front door. The path to the bunkhouse was completely buried, and when they finally made it to check on the men, they found all four of them alive and well, if cold and grumpy from being trapped inside for a day and a half. "Thought you might have frozen solid, boss," Tommy said cheerfully, his breath fogging in the frigid air. "Good to see you made it through." "Thanks to Mrs. Bennet." Elias glanced at Clara, something warm in his eyes. "She wouldn't let me do anything stupid." "Smart woman," Pete said approvingly. "We're going to need to dig out the barn, check on the horses, then see how many cattle we lost." The news when it came was better than expected. They'd lost 15 head, which was tragic, but survivable. The horses were fine. The barn had held, and as the men set about the work of digging out and assessing damage, life on the ranch slowly returned to normal. But something had shifted during the storm. Clara felt it in the way Elias looked at her now, in the way their conversations lasted a little longer, in the way he found excuses to be in the kitchen when she was cooking. And she felt it in herself, in the way her heart jumped when she heard his voice, in the way she found herself smiling at nothing, in the way the ranch had stopped feeling like a temporary refuge and started feeling like something else, something dangerous, something that scared her more than any blizzard. Because the last time she let herself feel this way about a man, she'd married him, and then she'd buried him, and she wasn't sure she could survive that kind of loss again. One evening in early March, as the days began to lengthen and the first hints of spring started to show in the slight warming of the air, Clara stood at the kitchen window washing dishes and watched Elias teaching Lucy to rope a fence post. Her daughter laughed with delight every time the loop landed true, and Elias's answering smile was genuine and unguarded in a way Clara rarely saw. "He's good with her," Sam said from behind her, making Clara jump. She hadn't heard him come in. "He is," Clara agreed, drying her hands on her apron. "Boss doesn't smile much, usually. Too serious, always worrying about the ranch, about the men, about everything." Sam poured himself coffee, watching through the window. "But he smiles around you too. Around your girl, especially. It's good to see." Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. But she thought about it later that night after Lucy was asleep and the house was quiet. Thought about the man who'd saved them, who'd given them a place when they had nowhere to go, who sang old ballads when he thought no one could hear. And she thought about the fact that her wages for 2 months of work would be enough to leave if she wanted to. Enough to rent a small place in town, maybe find other work, start rebuilding a life of her own. She'd been saving every penny, planning for the day when she could stand on her own 2 feet again. but the thought of leaving made her chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with practical concerns and everything to do with the man currently sitting in the next room, reading by lamplight, existing in her orbit in a way that had become essential to her sense of equilibrium. She was falling for Elias Ward. Maybe had already fallen somewhere between the blizzard and the biscuits and the thousand small kindnesses he'd shown her and Lucy, and she had no idea what to do about it, because he was her employer, because she was his cook, because the power imbalance between them was too great to ignore, because she'd been a widow for less than a year, and the idea of loving someone new felt like a betrayal of everything she'd had with Thomas, but mostly because she was terrified. Terrified of being hurt again, of losing again, of having something precious and watching it die. She'd barely survived losing Thomas. She wouldn't survive losing Elias too. So she said nothing, did nothing, just kept cooking and cleaning and pretending that her heart didn't race every time he walked into a room, kept telling herself that this feeling would pass, that it was just gratitude confused with something deeper, that she could control it if she tried hard enough. But hearts, Clara was learning, didn't listen to sense or reason or careful planning. Hearts did what they wanted when they wanted. Consequences be damned. And her heart, stubborn and foolish and terrifyingly alive, wanted Elias Ward. Spring arrived on the Ward ranch, not with a dramatic flourish, but in quiet increments. First came the subtle warming of the air, barely noticeable at first, but growing stronger with each passing day. Then the snow began to melt slowly at first, and then in rushing torrents that turned the land into a muddy maze. The cattle, lean from the hard winter, began to move more freely across the pastures, and with the lengthening days came a restlessness that seemed to affect everyone on the ranch, especially Clara. She stood at the kitchen window one mid-March morning, watching the sunrise over the mountains in the distance, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded her of hope. Her savings were growing. She had enough now, probably to rent a small place in Red Creek, enough to strike out on her own, to reclaim the independence she'd lost when Thomas died. The thought should have filled her with satisfaction. Instead, it felt like contemplating amputation. "You're up early." Clara turned to find Elias in the doorway, his hair damp from washing, his shirt not quite buttoned all the way. She forced herself to look away from the glimpse of skin at his throat, from the way the morning light caught in his eyes. "Couldn't sleep," she said, busying herself with the coffee pot. "Too much on my mind, I suppose." Want to talk about it? Did she? Could she tell him that she was thinking about leaving? About the impossibility of staying? About the way her heart had betrayed her by falling for a man she had no business falling for? Could she admit that every day she stayed made it harder to imagine going? Made the future without him seem colorless and empty? "Just thinking about spring," she said instead. "About what comes next." Elias moved into the kitchen, close enough that she could smell the soap he'd used, close enough that she had to grip the counter to keep herself from swaying toward him. "Clara, I've been meaning to talk to you about that." Her heart stopped. Here it was, the conversation she'd been dreading. He was going to tell her that he didn't need a cook anymore, that the job had always been temporary, that it was time for her to move on. "All right," she managed, keeping her voice steady. "The spring and summer months, they're busier on a ranch. More hands coming through, more work to be done. I'll be hiring extra men for the cattle drives and fence repairs." He paused, and Clara forced herself to meet his eyes. "I'd like to increase your wages, another 25 cents a day. And I was thinking if you wanted, there's that small house on the property, the one about a 4 mile west. It's been empty for years, but with some work it could be comfortable. Give you and Lucy your own space. More privacy." Clara stared at him, her mind struggling to process what he was saying. He wasn't asking her to leave. He was asking her to stay. Not just stay, but make this more permanent, more established. "I don't understand," she said slowly. "Why would you do that?" "Because you've more than earned it. Because the men would revolt if you left. Tommy actually threatened to quit if I didn't do something to make sure you stayed. Because Lucy deserves a real home, not just a borrowed room." He took a breath and something flickered in his eyes. "Because I want you to stay, Clara, both of you. For as long as you're willing." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning that went beyond wages and housing. Clara heard what he wasn't saying, saw it in the way he looked at her and the careful distance he maintained. Even as every fiber of his being seemed to lean toward her, he felt it too. This thing between them, this impossible, inappropriate, undeniable thing. Elias, Claire's voice caught, I can't accept charity. I won't be your obligation, your good deed, the widow you saved because you couldn't save your mother. Is that what you think this is? His voice was rough, almost angry. Clara, you stopped being charity the first night when you cooked dinner instead of collapsing from exhaustion. You stopped being an obligation when you made Pete write to his daughter. When you taught Tommy how to make biscuits that don't break teeth. When you turned this house into a home instead of just a place where men sleep between work shifts. And you sure as hell stopped being anything to do with my mother the first time. I.e., he stopped abruptly, jaw clenched, looking like he'd said more than he intended. The first time you… What? Clara whispered. Elias turned away, running a hand through his damp hair in a gesture of frustration. Nothing. Forget I said anything. Just think about the offer. All right, the house, the increased wages, no strings attached, no obligations beyond the work you're already doing. But there were strings. There were obligations. There were all the unspoken things vibrating in the air between them, all the feelings neither of them dared name, all the possibilities that terrified Clara as much as they tempted her. I'll think about it, she said finally, because she didn't know what else to say. Elias nodded once and left the kitchen, and Clara stood alone in the growing light, her hands shaking as she tried to pour coffee and failed, spilling it across the counter in a dark stream that looked like all her carefully maintained control running away. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Clara cooked mechanically, her mind elsewhere, turning the conversation over and over, examining it from every angle. The men noticed her distraction. Tommy asked 3 times if she was feeling all right, but she brushed off their concerns with false smiles and reassurances. Only Lucy seemed to see through her pretense. That evening, as Clara tucked her daughter into bed, the little girl looked up at her with Thomas's eyes and asked, "Mama, are you sad?" "No, sweet pea, just thinking about Papa." Clara hesitated. She thought about Thomas every day, carried him with her in the ache of old grief and the memories of the life they'd built together. But lately those thoughts had been joined by others. Thoughts of a different man, a different life, a different kind of love that felt like betrayal and salvation all at once. "A little," Claire admitted. "Do you think about Papa much?" "Sometimes, but I don't remember him very good anymore." Lucy's voice was small, guilty. "Is that bad?" Claire's heart broke a little. "No, darling, that's not bad. You were very young. It's natural. I remember he was tall and he sang songs and he smelled like horses." Lucy paused, considering Mr. Elias smells like horses too. "And he sings. I heard him once when he didn't know I was there. Does that mean he's like Papa?" "I know, sweet pea, they're different people. But you like him. I can tell out of the mouths of babes." Clara wondered when her 5-year-old daughter had become so perceptive, so able to read the truths Clara tried to hide, even from herself. "Mr. Elias has been very kind to us," Clara said carefully. "He looks at you the way Papa used to look at you when he thought you weren't watching." Lucy yawned, her eyes drifting closed. "I think he likes you too, Mama." Clara sat there long after Lucy fell asleep, her daughter's words echoing in her mind. Children saw things adults tried to hide. They saw the truth without all the complicated layers of propriety and fear and guilt that adults wrapped around everything. And the truth was simple, even if Clara didn't want to acknowledge it. She was falling in love with Elias Ward, maybe had already fallen somewhere between the blizzard and the coffee and the 1,000 small moments that had accumulated into something larger than their sum. But loving someone and being able to do something about it were 2 different things. Clara was his employee. She was a widow still wearing the shadow of grief. She was a woman with a child and no prospects beyond this ranch. And Elias was a good man who deserved better than a broken woman who came with complications and baggage and a heart that had already been shattered once. So Clara did what she'd been doing for months. She pushed the feelings down, buried them deep, and focused on the practical. In the morning, she'd give Elias her answer about the house and the wages. She'd accept because she'd be a fool not to, because Lucy deserved stability, because Winter had proven she couldn't make it on her own. But she'd maintain the distance between them. She'd keep the boundaries clear. She'd be his cook, nothing more. And she'd guard her heart with every defense she possessed. It was a good plan, a sensible plan. It lasted exactly 3 days. The spring storm that roared in on Saturday evening was different from the winter blizzards. It came with rain instead of snow, with thunder that shook the house and lightning that split the sky. Clara had sent Lucy to bed early, but the child was restless with the storm, scared of the thunder, and nothing Clara did seemed to soothe her. "I'll stay with you until you fall asleep," Clara promised, lying down beside her daughter and holding her close while the storm raged outside. She must have fallen asleep herself, because when she woke, the house was dark and quiet, except for the steady drum of rain on the roof. Lucy slept peacefully beside her, her fear forgotten in dreams. Claire extracted herself carefully and stood, intending to check that all the windows were closed against the rain. She was halfway down the stairs when she heard it, a crash from outside, followed by shouting. Clara ran to the window and saw in a flash of lightning that part of the barn roof had collapsed. In the next flash, she saw Elias and his men running toward the barn, toward the trapped and panicking horses. Without thinking, Clara grabbed a coat and ran outside. The rain hit her like a wall, cold and relentless, soaking through her nightgown and coat in seconds. She couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, couldn't hear anything over the roar of the storm. But she ran toward the barn anyway, toward the chaos, toward where she knew Elias would be putting himself in danger to save his animals. Inside the barn, it was bedlam. Horses screamed and kicked in their stalls. Terrified by the partial roof collapse in the storm, the men were trying to calm them, trying to lead them out to safety, but the horses were beyond reason. Clara saw Elias struggling with a particularly panicked mare, saw the moment when the horse reared and he lost his grip, saw him stumble backward toward a pile of collapsed timber. She didn't remember moving. One moment she was standing in the doorway, and the next she was grabbing Elias's arm, yanking him sideways, throwing them both clear as a beam crashed down right where he'd been standing. They landed hard in the mud, Clara on top of Elias, both of them breathing hard. For a moment they just lay there, stunned, while around them the chaos continued. Then Elias's arms came up around her, holding her tight, and she felt his heart pounding against her chest. "You could have been killed," he said roughly in her ear. "So could you, Claire. You shouldn't have. You can't just—" He stopped, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, raw. "God, when I saw you standing there, when I thought that beam might—" He didn't finish. Instead, his hand came up to cup the back of her head, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, they stayed like that, wrapped around each other in the mud and the rain, while something fundamental shifted between them. Then Tommy was there pulling them up, shouting something about getting the horses out, before more of the roof came down. The moment shattered, and Elias released her, his face unreadable in the darkness. But Clara felt branded by his touch, by the way he'd held her, by the emotion in his voice. The next hours passed in a blur of activity. They got all the horses out safely, moved them to a makeshift shelter in one of the outbuildings. They assessed the damage to the barn, bad but repayable. And finally, soaked and exhausted, they trudged back to the house as dawn began to break through the storm clouds. Clara's teeth were chattering by the time she got inside. She stood dripping in the entryway, suddenly aware that her nightgown was plastered to her body, that her hair was a soaked mess, that she probably looked like something the storm had dragged in. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," Elias said, his voice carefully neutral. "You'll catch your death." "So will you. I'll be fine. I'm used to." He stopped looking at her, really looking at her, and something in his carefully maintained control seemed to crack. Clara, just her name, but the way he said it held volumes. "Don't," Clara whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was warning him or begging him. "Don't what?" "Don't say what we've both been avoiding for weeks. Don't acknowledge that every time I'm in the same room with you, I have to fight the urge to—" He took a breath, visibly steadying himself. "You risked your life tonight for me. You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." Clara's voice was shaking, "because the thought of you being hurt, of something happening to you, I couldn't, I can't. Can't what? Can't lose someone else I care about?" The words burst out of her, too loud, too raw, too honest. "I can't lose you, Elias. I can't watch another man." She stopped, horrified by what she'd almost said. The silence that followed was deafening. Elias stared at her, water dripping from his hair, his chest rising and falling with quick breaths. Clara wanted to take the words back, to stuff them back inside where they belonged, to pretend she'd never let them escape. But it was too late. The truth was out, hanging between them like the storm still raging outside. Another man knew what. Elias's voice was soft, dangerous in its intensity. Clara lifted her chin, finding some core of courage she didn't know she possessed. If she was going to ruin everything, she might as well do it completely. "Another man I love," she said clearly. "I can't lose another man I love. And I know I shouldn't feel this way. I know it's too soon and too complicated and probably wrong in every way that matters. I know you're my employer and I'm your cook, and there's a power imbalance that makes this inappropriate. I know I'm supposed to be grieving Thomas, supposed to be focused on building a life for Lucy, supposed to be sensible and practical and all the things a proper widow should be. But I'm not sensible, apparently. I'm foolish enough to have fallen in love with you anyway." The words hung in the air, impossible to take back. Clara watched Elias's face, trying to read his expression, trying to prepare herself for the rejection that was surely coming. He'd be kind about it, probably. He'd let her down gently, tell her he was flattered, but didn't return her feelings, make it clear that she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Instead, he crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, cuped her face in his hands, and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate and hungry, and full of weeks of denied wanting. His lips were cold from the rain, but his mouth was warm, and Clara found herself gripping his soaked shirt, pulling him closer, kissing him back with equal desperation. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Elias rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the day you stood in Morrison's store, desperate and fierce, and so damn brave it made my chest ache. I've wanted to do that every morning when you hand me coffee, every evening when you laugh at something Tommy says, every night when I lie in bed knowing you're just down the hall and wondering if you feel even a fraction of what I feel." "What do you feel?" Clara whispered. "Everything." His hands tightened on her face. "Clara, I feel everything. I'm in love with you. Have been for weeks, maybe longer. I tried to fight it, tried to tell myself it was wrong, that you were my employee, that you needed time to grieve, that I was taking advantage of your situation. But tonight, when I saw you running toward danger, when I thought that beam might hit you, I realized something. I don't want to fight this anymore. I don't want to pretend I don't love you. I don't want to waste whatever time we might have being sensible and proper and keeping my distance." Clara felt tears streaming down her face, mixing with the rainwater still dripping from her hair. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm terrified of losing you, of letting myself love you and then having you taken away like Thomas was taken away. I don't think I could survive that again. I'm scared too." Elias's thumb brushed away her tears. "I'm scared of not being enough, of not being able to give you everything you deserve, of failing you the way I failed my mother by not being able to help her. But I'm more scared of never taking this chance, of letting fear keep us apart when we could have something good together, something real. What about Lucy? What about the ranch hands? What will people say? Lucy likes me. She told me so last week when she asked if I'd teach her to ride. The ranch hands already treat you like the lady of the house, whether you've noticed or not. And as for what people say," Elias smiled, and it was the most beautiful thing Clara had ever seen. "I stopped caring about that the moment I decided to offer a job to a desperate widow in Morrison's store. Let them talk. We know the truth." Clara laughed through her tears. "What truth is that? That you needed help and I needed you. That this started as one thing and became something else. That sometimes the best things in life come from the worst circumstances." He kissed her again, softer this time. "That you're the strongest, most stubborn, most remarkable woman I've ever met. That your daughter is a gift. That this ranch has felt more like home in the 3 months you've been here than it did in all the years before. That I love you, Clara Bennett. And I'd very much like the chance to prove it to you every day for the rest of our lives." "That's a lot of truth," Clara managed. It's the only truth that matters. Elias pulled back slightly, his expression turning serious. I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow. I know it's too soon. I know you need time, but I'm asking for permission to court you properly, to give this thing between us a real chance to see where it might go, without fear or guilt or hiding. Can you give me that? Could she? Could Clara let herself hope again, love again, trust that this time might be different? Could she take this leap of faith with a man who'd proven his worth 100 times over, but who still carried the risk of loss inherent in loving anyone? She thought of Thomas, of the life they'd built and lost. She thought of the woman she'd been then, younger, more naive, less scarred by grief and hardship. That woman was gone, lost somewhere in the winter snow, along with her long hair and her innocence. But maybe that was all right. Maybe the woman she'd become, harder, wiser, more resilient, was better equipped for this second chance. Maybe loving Elias didn't mean betraying Thomas's memory. Maybe it meant honoring the lesson Thomas's death had taught her, that life was short and uncertain, that happiness was precious and rare, that love should be grasped with both hands whenever it appeared, because tomorrow was never promised. Yes, Clara said, and felt something that had been clenched tight in her chest for months finally loosen. Yes, Elias, you can court me. We can give this a chance. We can see where it goes. The smile that broke across his face was worth every risk, every fear, every moment of uncertainty. He pulled her close again, holding her like she was precious, like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking for years. They stood there in the entryway, soaked in muddy and probably catching pneumonia. And Clara had never felt warmer in her life. Outside, the storm was finally passing, the rain easing to a gentle patter. Inside, something new was beginning, something fragile and hopeful and terrifying in its potential. Clara didn't know where this path would lead, didn't know if she and Elias would work out, if they could build something lasting, if love would be enough to overcome all the practical obstacles in their way. But for the first time since Thomas died, she was willing to find out, willing to take the risk, willing to open her heart to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she could be happy again. We should get out of these wet clothes, Elias said finally, reluctantly releasing her before we both catch our death. Probably wise. Clara smiled up at him. Though I have to say, this is the best I've felt while soaking wet and covered in mud. He laughed, the sound rich and genuine. Go get changed. I'll check on Lucy. Make sure the storm didn't wake her. She's probably still sound asleep. Nothing wakes that child once she's truly out. Clara hesitated, then rose on her toes to kiss him quickly. Thank you, Elias, for everything. For saving us, for giving us a home, for this. Thank you for letting me, he said softly. Now go. Before I forget, I'm supposed to be a gentleman and kiss you again. Clara went, climbing the stairs with legs that felt shaky and a heart that felt too full for her chest. In her room, she changed quickly into dry clothes, her hands trembling slightly as she buttoned her dress. Through the window, she could see the first rays of true sunlight breaking through the clouds, painting the wet landscape in gold. A new day, a new beginning, a second chance at happiness that she'd never expected to find. Lucy was indeed still sleeping, curled up in her small bed with her rag doll clutched to her chest. Clara stood in the doorway, watching her daughter sleep, and felt a wave of gratitude so intense it nearly knocked her over. They'd survived. Against all odds, through winter and illness and despair, they'd survived. And now, maybe they'd do more than just survive. Maybe they'd actually live again. Downstairs, she could hear Elias moving around, probably changing into dry clothes himself. Soon the ranch hands would wake, would need breakfast, would start the work of repairing the barn. Life would continue in its practical, necessary rhythms. But everything was different now. Everything had changed in the space of a kiss, in the admission of feelings that could no longer be denied. Clara didn't know what came next, didn't know how they'd navigate this new territory, didn't know if the path ahead would be smooth or rocky. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wasn't walking it alone anymore. She had Elias, she had Lucy. She had this ranch that had become home without her quite noticing. She had possibilities stretching out before her like the Colorado plains, vast and sometimes harsh, but full of potential. And for a woman who'd stood in a cold cabin with scissors in hand, ready to cut off pieces of herself for survival, that was more than she'd ever dared hope for. It was everything. The weeks following the storm brought changes to the Ward ranch that went far beyond the repaired barn roof. Spring settled in with earnest intention, transforming the landscape from white and barren to green and alive. The cattle grew fat on new grass. The horses shed their winter coats, and everywhere Clara looked, she saw evidence of renewal, of things coming back to life after a long, hard winter, including herself. Elias courted her the way he did everything else, with quiet determination and unexpected thoughtfulness. He brought her wild flowers he'd found while checking fence lines, their stems still damp with morning dew. He saved her the last cup of coffee in the morning, remembering how she liked it after everyone else had been served. He taught Lucy to ride on the gentlest mare, his patience with the little girl making Clara's heart ache in the best way possible. And in the evenings after Lucy was asleep and the ranch hands had retreated to the bunkhouse, they'd sit together on the porch and talk. Really talk about everything and nothing, about their pasts and their hopes for the future, about Thomas. And Elias never flinched from those conversations, never seemed jealous of the man who'd come before him, about Elias's mother and the guilt he still carried for not being able to save her, about Clara's fears and Elias's dreams and all the complicated emotions that came with building something new from the ruins of old sorrows. "I used to think happiness was something you earned," Clara said one evening in late April, watching the sun set over the mountains. "That if you worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, you'd be rewarded with a good life. But Thomas worked harder than anyone I knew, and he still died. We still lost everything." "So what do you think now?" Elias asked, his arm draped casually across the back of the bench they shared, not quite touching her, but close enough that she felt his warmth. "Now I think happiness is something you choose, something you grab hold of when it appears, even if you don't deserve it, even if you're scared, even if it makes no logical sense." She turned to look at him, at this man who'd saved her life without even knowing he was doing it. "I choose this, Elias. I choose you. I choose to be happy again, even though it terrifies me." He took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "You terrify me too," he admitted. "The thought of losing you, of something happening to you or Lucy, it keeps me up at night. But the thought of never having this, never taking this chance, that's worse. That's the only thing that scares me more." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell. And Clara marveled at how natural this felt, how right. She'd loved Thomas with the intensity of youth, with all the passion and certainty of someone who'd never known loss. What she felt for Elias was different, deeper, quieter, tempered by experience and hardship. It was a love that understood the cost of caring, that knew how quickly happiness could be snatched away, and chose to love anyway. It was a grown woman's love, and it was all the stronger for it. By early May, the small house Elias had mentioned, the 1 mile from the main house, had been cleaned and repaired. Tommy and the other hands had worked on it in their spare time, replacing broken windows, patching the roof, making it habitable. It wasn't much, just 3 rooms and a small porch, but it had good bones and a view of the mountains that took Clara's breath away. "What do you think?" Elias asked, standing beside her as she surveyed the freshly painted walls and the sturdy furniture he'd had brought in. "I think it's perfect," Clara said honestly. "But Elias, I need you to understand something. If Lucy and I move in here, it's not because I want distance from you. It's because Lucy needs to see that you're standing on your own 2 feet." Elias finished. "Because you need to know you're staying because you want to, not because you have nowhere else to go. Because the ranch hands are already gossiping and you want to protect your reputation in Lucy's future." "I know, Clara. I understand." She shouldn't have been surprised that he understood. Elias always understood, always seemed to see right through to the heart of what she was feeling, even when she couldn't quite articulate it herself. "I'll still cook for everyone," she said. "I'll still be at the main house most of the day. It's just that you need your own space, your own home. I get it." He smiled, though something in his eyes looked a little sad. "I'll miss hearing Lucy's laughter first thing in the morning, and I'll miss knowing you're just down the hall if I need to talk to someone in the middle of the night. But I want you to have this, Clara. Want you to have independence and choices and a place that's truly yours." They moved into the small house the following week, and Clara couldn't help crying as she arranged their few possessions in the space. Happy tears this time, not the desperate, terrified tears of last winter. Lucy ran from room to room, declaring everything perfect, claiming the smaller bedroom as her own, and immediately beginning to plan how she'd decorate it. "Mama, can I have flowers?" Lucy asked, pressing her face against the window. "Real ones in a garden." "You can have flowers," Clara promised. "We'll plant them together." That night, after Lucy was asleep in her new room, Clara sat on her small porch and looked up at the stars. The main house was visible in the distance, lamplight glowing in the windows. She could walk there in 5 minutes, could go back any time she wanted. But this little house with its creaky floors and drafty windows was hers. She'd earned it, she'd worked for it, and that made all the difference. She heard footsteps approaching and smiled before she even saw him. She'd know Elias's walk anywhere now, the steady, measured pace of a man who was never in a hurry, but always got where he was going. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, settling onto the porch step beside her. "Too much happiness. Keeps me awake." Clara leaned against his shoulder, and he wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "Is that a thing? Being too happy to sleep? If it is, I've got the same problem." He kissed the top of her head. "Strange, isn't it? How fast things can change. Last winter you were ready to sell your hair for bread. Now look at us. Now look at us." Clara echoed and felt the truth of it settle in her bones. They'd come so far, through so much, and somehow ended up here together, happy, building something neither of them had dared hope for. June arrived with warm days and star-filled nights. The ranch was busy with the work of spring branding and fence repairs. Extra hands had been hired, just as Elias predicted, and Clara found herself cooking for 10 men instead of 5. The work was exhausting but satisfying, and her reputation as a cook had apparently spread because the new hands all seemed pleasantly surprised that the food was actually edible. "Mom, these are the best biscuits I've had since my mama died," one young cowboy told her earnestly, and Clara had to turn away to hide her smile. Lucy thrived in the summer warmth. She'd become a fixture around the ranch, helping with chores and charming every cowboy who crossed her path. She still asked about Thomas sometimes, but those questions came less frequently now, and they didn't hurt quite as much. Clara talked about him honestly when Lucy asked, keeping his memory alive while gently making space for their new life. One evening in late June, as Clara was cleaning up after dinner, Elias appeared in the kitchen doorway with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Can we talk?" he asked. Clara's heart skipped. Those 3 words never meant anything good. "Of course. What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. I just—" He ran a hand through his hair, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Can we go for a walk?" They left Lucy playing checkers with Tommy on the main house porch and walked in silence toward the small rise behind the barn, the place where you could see the whole ranch spread out below and the mountains. Rising in the distance, the sun was setting, painting everything in gold and amber, making the ordinary landscape look like something out of a painting. When they reached the top of the rise, Elias stopped and turned to face her. In the fading light, Clara could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "Clara, I know I said I wouldn't rush you. I know I said I'd give you all the time you needed to grieve, to heal, to figure out what you wanted." He took a breath. "But I'm going to break that promise because I can't wait anymore. I've tried to be patient, tried to give you space, but the truth is I don't want to wait. I don't want to waste another day, another hour, pretending we're not already building a life together." Clara's breath caught. "Elias, let me finish, please." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box, and Clara felt the world tilt sideways. "I love you, Clara. I love Lucy. I love coming home and knowing you'll be there. I love watching you cook and argue with me about whether the cattle need more hay. I love the way you bite your lip when you're concentrating and the way you hum while you work. I love that you're stubborn and fierce and brave enough to walk 7 miles through a blizzard to save your daughter. I love everything about you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving it." He opened the box, revealing a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the sunset and threw light in all directions. "Marry me, Clara. Make this official. Make this ranch your home, not just your workplace. Let me be Lucy's father and your husband and the luckiest man in Colorado Territory. Say yes, and I promise I'll spend every day trying to deserve you." Clara stared at the ring, at the man holding it, at the future being offered to her on a hilltop in the golden light of sunset. 6 months ago, she'd been ready to cut off her hair and beg for bread. 3 months ago, she'd been sure she'd never love anyone again. And now this impossible, beautiful, terrifying offer of forever. "It's too soon," she heard herself say. "People will talk. They'll say I'm disrespecting Thomas's memory, that I'm moving too fast, that we barely know each other." "Do you care what people say?" "I care about Lucy, about her reputation, about protecting yourself," Elias said gently. "About having an excuse to say no because saying yes scares you. And I understand that, Clara. I do. But I'm asking you anyway. I'm asking you to be brave one more time, to take one more risk on something that might not work out but probably will, to choose happiness over fear." He was right. Damn him. He was absolutely right. Clara was scared not of Elias or marriage or any of the practical concerns she'd listed. She was scared of letting herself be this happy, of believing she deserved this second chance, of trusting that maybe, just maybe, this time things would work out. She looked out at the ranch spread below them, at the house where she cooked, at the small house where she and Lucy lived, at the barn and the cattle and the mountains beyond. This place had saved her life. This man had given her back her dignity. This life, strange and unexpected as it was, had become hers, and she wanted it. God help her, she wanted all of it. "Yes," Clara said, and watched Elias's face transform with joy. "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes to all of it. The ranch, the life, the future, everything. Yes." He pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around while she laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. When he set her down, he kissed her with a passion that made her forget about propriety and reputation and everything except this moment. This man, this love that had saved her from despair. "When?" Elias asked when they finally broke apart, both breathing hard. "When what?" "When will you marry me?" "Tomorrow, next week. I'll ride to town right now and get the preacher if you want." Clara laughed, giddy with happiness and possibility. "Maybe not tomorrow, but soon. Very soon, before I lose my nerve and remember all the reasons this is crazy." "It's not crazy," Elias said firmly. "It's the best thing either of us has ever done." They walked back to the main house hand in hand, the ring on Clara's finger catching the last rays of sunlight. Tommy took one look at them and let out a whoop that brought the other ranch hands running. Hot damn, the boss finally did it. Tommy grabbed Clara and spun her around laughing. I mean Mrs. Ward to be. This is the best news we've had all year." The congratulations came fast and enthusiastic from all the men, even Jake, who rarely smiled. Pete pulled Clara into a fierce hug and whispered, "You've made him happier than I've ever seen him. Thank you for that." Lucy, watching from the porch, seemed confused by all the commotion until Clara knelt down and explained what was happening. "Mr. Elias asked me to marry him," Clara said gently, "which means he'd become part of our family. Would that be all right with you, Sweet Pea?" Lucy's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Does that mean I can call him Papa?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "If he says it's all right, and if you want to, then yes." "Can I, Mr. Elias?" Lucy asked seriously. "Can I call you Papa?" Elias knelt beside Clara, and his voice was suspiciously rough when he answered. "I'd be honored, Lucy. Nothing would make me happier." Lucy threw her arms around his neck, and Clara watched them embrace, watched this man who'd saved them both hold her daughter like she was precious, and felt her heart finally fully heal. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Red Creek on a Sunday morning in July. Clara wore a new dress, pale blue, nothing fancy but clean and pretty and hers. Lucy was her only attendant, wearing a white dress and clutching a bouquet of wildflowers they'd picked that morning. The ranch hands filled the pews along with a few townspeople who'd heard about the wedding and come out of curiosity or kindness or both. Mr. Morrison was there beaming like he'd orchestrated the whole thing. And Pete's daughter had made the journey from Missouri with her family, arriving just in time for the wedding, and the old man couldn't stop smiling. As Clara walked down the short aisle, no one to give her away. But she didn't need that. She was giving herself. She caught sight of Elias waiting at the altar. He was wearing his best suit, his hair neatly combed, his face full of an emotion so powerful it took her breath away. Love, pure, uncomplicated, absolute love. The ceremony was simple. The vows were traditional. But when Elias slipped the ring onto her finger and the preacher declared them husband and wife, Clara felt something settle into place that had been broken for so long. Not a healing she'd been healing for months, but a completion. A sense that this was exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly who she was meant to be with. "You may kiss your bride, God," the preacher said with a smile. Elias cupped Clara's face in his hands, his touch infinitely gentle, and kissed her with a tenderness that made her eyes sting with happy tears. The small congregation erupted in applause and cheers, with Tommy whistling loud enough to wake the dead. "Mrs. Ward," Elias said softly for her ears alone. "My wife, my husband," Clara answered, marveling at how natural the word felt. My Elias. They held the reception at the ranch with food Clara had prepared over the past week and music from a fiddle player Morrison had hired as a wedding gift. Lucy danced with every cowboy who asked, delighted to be wearing her fancy dress and staying up past bedtime. The men ate and drank and told increasingly outrageous stories about ranch life. And Claire and Elias moved through it all together, his hand never far from hers, her smile constant and genuine. As the sun began to set, Claire found herself standing on the porch of what was now officially her home. Not the small house, but the main house, the ranch house, where she'd spent her first night as Elias's employee and would spend tonight as his wife. The change in status felt both momentous and somehow like it had always been inevitable. "Happy?" Elias asked, coming to stand beside her. "Impossibly so." Clara leaned into him and his arm came around her waist, solid and sure. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is real, that I'm here, that we're married, that life can be this good after being so hard." "Believe it," Elias said. "This is real, Clara. This is our life now, and it's going to be good. I promise you that." Promises. Clara had learned to be wary of promises, had learned that life made no guarantees and tomorrow was never assured. But she believed Elias when he made them, believed that he'd do everything in his power to keep them. And if something happened, if fate dealt them another cruel hand, at least they'd face it together. The summer passed in a blur of work and happiness. Clara settled into her role as Elias's wife with surprising ease, managing the household and the cooking. And Lucy, while Elias ran the ranch. They were partners in every sense of the word, making decisions together, supporting each other, building something that was stronger than either of them alone. Lucy thrived under Elias's attention. He taught her to ride properly, to rope fence posts, to recognize different bird calls. He never tried to replace Thomas in her memories, but he carved out his own space in her heart, and Clara watched their bond grow with gratitude and joy. The ranch hands adapted to the new dynamic without complaint. If anything, they seemed happier to have Clara officially established as the lady of the house. The hierarchy was clearer now, the roles more defined, and Clara found she had more authority and respect than she'd ever expected. Even the townspeople, who might have gossiped about the quick marriage, seemed to accept it. Clara suspected Morrison had something to do with that, spreading the story of how Elias had saved a desperate widow and fallen in love like something out of a fairy tale. Let them romanticize it, Clara thought. The truth was complicated and messy and full of hard edges, but the core of it was simple. She'd needed help. He'd offered it, and somehow they'd found love in the process. By September, as the first hints of fall began to color the mountains, Clara realized she was late. At first, she told herself it was stress, or the change in seasons, or any of a dozen other explanations. But when another week passed, and then another, she couldn't deny the truth any longer. She was pregnant. The realization hit her one morning while she was making biscuits, her hands stilling in the flour as the certainty settled over her. A baby. She was going to have Elias's baby, another child, a brother or sister for Lucy, a new life growing inside her. Clara sat down hard in the nearest chair, her heart racing. She'd had such a difficult time with Lucy, such a painful birth. The thought of going through that again terrified her. And what if something went wrong? What if she lost the baby? What if the pregnancy was too hard on her body? Too much after everything else she'd been through? But beneath the fear, beneath the worry, there was something else. Joy. Pure, unadulterated joy. At the thought of bringing Elias's child into the world, of creating something new from their love, of expanding their family in this most fundamental way. She told him that night after Lucy was asleep, when they were sitting together on their bed in the room they now shared. Clara had planned to be calm and practical about it, to present it as just another piece of information they needed to discuss. Instead, she burst into tears the moment she opened her mouth. Clara. Elias was immediately alarmed, pulling her into his arms. What's wrong? What happened? I'm pregnant. She sobbed into his shoulder. I'm going to have a baby, your baby, and I'm terrified and happy, and I don't know what to feel. Elias went very still. Then his arms tightened around her, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. You're sure? As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor. We'll go to town tomorrow first thing. Get it confirmed. He pulled back to look at her, his eyes bright. Clara, this is wonderful. This is the best news I could have imagined. You're not worried, not scared. Terrified, he admitted, but also happier than I have any right to be. We're going to have a baby, a child of our own. Lucy's going to be a big sister. Clara, this is... He seemed to run out of words and just kissed her instead, pouring all his joy and fear and love into the gesture. They went to town the next day, and the doctor confirmed what Clara already knew. She was about 2 months along, due in late April or early May. The doctor checked her over carefully, asking questions about her first pregnancy, and declared her healthy enough to carry the child safely. Of course, there are no guarantees, he warned, but you're young and strong, Mrs. Ward. No reason to think this won't go smoothly. Lucy took the news with the enthusiasm only a 6-year-old could muster. A baby, Mama. Can we name it? Can I help take care of it? Will it be a boy or a girl? We'll have to wait and see, Clara said, laughing at her daughter's excitement. But yes, you can help. You'll be the best big sister. The months that followed were both harder and easier than Clara expected. The pregnancy itself was difficult. She was sick almost every morning, exhausted by afternoon, and her body ached in ways she'd forgotten. But Elias was there through all of it, holding her hair back when she was sick, rubbing her feet when they swelled, taking over more of the household work without complaint. And the ranch hands, those rough cowboys who cussed and spit and worked like dogs, treated her like she was made of glass. They insisted on doing any heavy lifting, refused to let her work too hard, and Tommy actually scolded her once for trying to carry a pot that he deemed too heavy for a lady in her condition. Winter came again, but this time Clara wasn't scared. This time she had a warm house, a full pantry, a husband who loved her, and a daughter who was thriving. The snow fell and the wind howled, but inside they were safe, and warm and happy. On a cold night in February, Claire A. woke to Elias singing softly in the darkness. She lay still, listening to the old cowboy ballad about love and loss and new beginnings, and felt the baby move inside her as if responding to his voice. He can hear you, Clara said softly. Or she can. Good. Elias's hand found hers in the darkness. Want them to know my voice. Want them to know they're loved before they even get here. They'll know, Clara promised. How could they not? They're already the luckiest child in Colorado, and they don't even know it yet. Spring returned with its usual drama of melting snow and muddy ground and new growth bursting from earth that had seemed dead just weeks before. Clara's belly grew round and full, and by April she was so large she could barely see her feet. She'd stopped cooking for the ranch hands, handing those duties over to a temporary cook Elias had hired so she could rest. She spent her days preparing for the baby, washing tiny clothes, setting up a cradle Elias had built with his own hands. Lucy helped enthusiastically, chattering constantly about what they'd do when the baby arrived, how she'd teach it everything she knew. On a warm evening in late April, Clara was sitting on the porch, watching the sunset when the first pain hit. She gasped, clutching her swollen belly, and Elias, who'd been sitting beside her, was on his feet instantly. Is it time? I think so. Clara breathed through the contraction, remembering this from Lucy's birth. The waves of pain that started gentle and built to something overwhelming. You should get the doctor. And ask Tommy to take Lucy to his sister's place in town. She doesn't need to be here for this. The next hours passed in a blur of pain and effort. The doctor arrived calm and efficient. Elias stayed with Clara, holding her hand, wiping her face with cool water, murmuring encouragement when she wanted to scream. It was harder than Lucy's birth, longer and more painful, and there were moments when Clara was sure she couldn't do it, couldn't bring this child into the world. But then she thought about winter mornings when she'd had nothing left but the will to survive. She thought about walking 7 miles through a blizzard. She thought about the scissors in her hand and the choice she'd been ready to make. She'd survived all of that. She could survive this too. Almost there, Clara, the doctor said. One more push. Give me one more. Clara bore down with everything she had left, squeezing Elias's hand hard enough to break bones, and then release. A moment of profound relief followed immediately by the most beautiful sound in the world. A baby crying. It's a boy, the doctor announced, holding up a squalling, red-faced infant. A healthy boy. Congratulations, Mrs. Ward. Clara reached for her son with shaking arms, and the moment they placed him on her chest, still wet and warm and perfect, she fell completely in love all over again. He had dark hair like Elias, a strong cry, tiny fingers that gripped hers with surprising strength. Hello, little one, Clara whispered. Welcome to the world. Elias was crying, actually crying, as he looked down at his son. He's perfect, Clara. He's absolutely perfect. You're perfect. I can't believe I don't know what to say. Say hello to your son. Clara shifted the baby slightly so Elias could see him better. James. Elias warded. If that's all right with you, James. Elias touched the baby's tiny hand with one finger, and James immediately grabbed hold. Hello, James. I'm your father, and I promise you'll never go hungry, never be scared, never doubt for a moment that you're loved. It was the same promise Clara had made to Lucy in the dark cabin last winter. The promise every parent made to every child, knowing they couldn't guarantee it, but swearing to try anyway. By the time Lucy came home the next day, delivered by an excited Tommy who'd been pacing the ranch all night, Claire was propped up in bed with James sleeping in her arms. Lucy approached cautiously, eyes wide, clearly not sure what to make of this tiny creature who'd suddenly joined their family. This is your brother, Clara said softly. Come meet him. Lucy climbed carefully onto the bed and peered at the baby. He's very small. You were this small once. Really? Lucy seemed skeptical. Can I touch him? Gently, Clara guided Lucy's hand to James's head, showing her how to stroke his soft hair. See, he's real. He's ours. Ours, Lucy repeated, wonder in her voice. Then she looked up at Clara with Thomas's eyes and said, Mama, are we a real family now? Clara's throat tightened with emotion. We've always been a real family, sweet pea, you and me, but now we're a bigger family. Now it's you and me and Papa, Elias and baby James, and we're all going to take care of each other. All right. All right. Lucy leaned closer to the baby, studying him. Seriously, I'm going to teach you everything, James. How to ride horses and rope fence posts, and which clouds look like rabbits. I'm going to be the best big sister ever. I know you will be, Clara said, pulling Lucy close with her free arms so she held both her children. I know you will. The months that followed were exhausting and chaotic and wonderful. James was a good baby, healthy and strong, with lungs that could wake the entire ranch when he decided it was time to eat. Clara was tired constantly, but it was a different kind of tired than the desperate exhaustion of last winter. This was the tired of too much happiness, too much love, too much life happening all at once. Elias was a devoted father, getting up in the middle of the night to walk with James when he was fussy, changing diapers without complaint, singing the same cowboy ballads that had comforted Clara months ago. And Lucy was everything she'd promised to be, and more. A patient and loving big sister who took her responsibilities seriously. One evening in late summer, nearly a year after the day Clara had walked 7 miles through a blizzard to trade her hair for bread, she stood on the porch of the ranch house and looked out at the land stretching endlessly in all directions. The sun was setting, painting everything in gold and rose, and somewhere in the distance she could hear cattle lowing and cowboys singing and all the sounds of a ranch at day's end. Behind her, through the open door, she could hear Elias reading to Lucy while James made small baby noises from his cradle. Her family, her home, her life, so different from anything she could have imagined a year ago. So much better than anything she dared hope for. Elias appeared in the doorway, James in his arms. He's awake and wants his mama. Clara took her son, settled him against her shoulder, and leaned into Elias's side when he wrapped an arm around her. Together they stood and watched the sunset. Three people bound by love and circumstance and the choices they'd made. "Do you ever think about that day?" Elias asked quietly. "The day in Morrison's store." "Every day," Claire admitted. "I think about who I was then, what I was prepared to do, and I think about what would have happened if you hadn't been there. If you hadn't offered me that job, I'd like to think someone else would have helped, that you would have found another way. Maybe, but I'm glad it was you." Clara turned her face up to kiss him softly. "I'm glad it was you who saved us. You who loved us. You who gave us this life. You saved yourself, Clara. I just gave you a place to land." Elias kissed her forehead. "But I'm glad I was there too. Glad I got the chance to love you, to build this life with you." They stood together in the fading light, their son between them, their daughter singing somewhere inside, their future stretching out like the Colorado plains, vast and sometimes harsh, but full of possibility. Clara's hair had grown back, falling to her shoulders now in waves she'd stopped trying to control, but she never forgot what it had meant to cut it off. Never forgot the desperation that had driven her to that moment. She'd given up her hair for bread, but a cowboy had said, "Keep it, I'll feed you both." And he had. He'd fed her body and her soul and her heart that she'd thought was too broken to ever work again. He'd given her not just food, but a future, not just shelter, but a home, not just survival, but a life worth living. And on this summer evening, with her husband beside her and her children safe and happy, Clara Bennett Ward finally understood what it meant to be truly wealthy. Not in money or possessions or any of the things she'd once thought mattered, but in love and family and the knowledge that no matter what storms came, and storms would come, because life was like that, they'd face them together. She was rich beyond measure, and it had all started with a pair of scissors, a blizzard, and a cowboy who'd cared enough to help a desperate stranger. "Thank you," Clara whispered into the warm evening air, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to Elias or to God, or to fate itself. "Thank you for this." Elias's arm tightened around her. "No, Clara, thank you for taking the chance, for saying yes, for choosing to live again when it would have been so much easier to just give up." James yawned and snuggled closer to Clara's chest, already drifting back to sleep. Inside, Lucy's singing had been replaced by the quiet sounds of a child settling down for the night. And all around them, the ranch, their home, prepared for darkness, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring another day of work and life and all the ordinary miracles that made up a good existence. Clara closed her eyes and breathed in deeply, smelling hay and horses and the wild sweetness of prairie grass, feeling the weight of her son in her arms and her husband's strength beside her. This was happiness. This was home. This was everything she'd almost lost and somehow impossibly found again. The widow who tried to trade her hair for bread had become a wife and mother who wanted for nothing. And somewhere in the great cosmic balance of the universe, Clara thought that maybe, just maybe, she'd finally gotten what she deserved. Not because she'd earned it through suffering, but because she'd been brave enough to accept it when it was offered. Because she'd chosen hope over despair, love over fear, life over mere survival. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above the Colorado plains, Clara Bennett Ward smiled and held her family close, grateful beyond words for the cowboy who'd said, "Keep your hair, I'll feed you both," and had given her the whole world instead.